Dear Chair of Conference Organizing Committee, dear guests and participants, ladies and gentlemen, good morning from Athens. First of all, I would like to thank most sincerely Professor Siriopoulou and her team for the kind invitation to participate in this important conference with the title Quality of Life in People with Intellectual Disabilities, including Autism. It is an honor. Thank you also for the opportunity offered to us to present the progress made in Greece at the ministerial level regarding ensuring equal access to education for persons with disabilities. The history of people with disabilities and their education in Greece has undergone various stages of change influenced by the social perception of each period and the broader socio-political context. Early attempts to address their diverse needs can be traced back to the first half of the previous century, when educational provision was primarily provided by private or religious and charitable initiatives. Over time, the state's involvement in the education of the vulnerable students, including students with disabilities, became more and more prominent. However, it was not until 1975 that the Greek constitution clearly stated that education is public and free for all students. From that point on, throughout the 80s and 90s, the issue of equitable access to education for students with disabilities began to gain ground. Several factors contributed to this development. One was the Greece's membership in the European Union. Another was the signing of the Salamanca Statement and Framework for Action, which outlined a new thinking on inclusion and school participation. In this direction, over the years, several legislative attempts have been made with varying degrees of success that attempted to bridge the gap between special and mainstream education. However, it was after the ratification of the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that Greece experienced an intensification of the discourse on inclusive education, particularly at the ministerial level and at least at the level of stated policies, according to our archival data. Initially, the ministerial discourse on inclusion primarily focused on the rights and needs of persons with disability. But over time, there has been a gradual realization that inclusive education should not only be perceived as a special needs issue, it should be perceived as an issue that necessitates wider reforms in the school architecture in order for the system to respond to the diverse needs of all learners. In this context, the idea of a paradigmatic shift from previous educational responses to student diversity became a focal point. More recently, this necessity has become even more prominent for specific reasons. First of all, statistical data indicate that the percentage of those who traditionally find themselves in situations of greater risk of educational exclusion remains high within the Greek educational system. Indicatively, we mention that according to statistics from 2021, 32% of children under 18 years old in Greece lived in households experiencing poverty or social exclusion. In the same vein, it is estimated that 44,500 refugee and migrant children are currently in Greece, out of which 2,000 are unaccompanied. With regard to students with disabilities, in 2021, 18,607 children were beneficiaries of disability allowances in Greece, representing what is perhaps more interesting as regards the education of students with disabilities is the fact that during the last years, there is a significant increase in the number of students with disabilities that attend mainstream schools. For instance, the table shows that the total number of students with disabilities attending mainstream school was almost 68,000 in 2014, which increased to almost 91,000 in 2020 and is now over 100,000. At the same time, there has been a slight increase in the number of students attending different types of special schools, rising from 10,351 in 2016 to 12,841 in 2021. All the above statistics highlight the necessity for an inclusive-oriented reform. The necessity of an inclusive-oriented reform is also supported by research evidence, which indicates that despite steps already taken, there are still many challenges. To mention just a few, at a policy level, there is no comprehensive educational sector plan for inclusion. At the meso level, a major barrier has been the focus on a deficit approach to disability. At the micro level, there is still a mismatch between the discourse on inclusion and its implementation. Last but not least, a number of European and international recommendations have been made to Greece, indicating that promoting inclusive education is necessary for the country's sustainable growth. For instance, the concluding observations of the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities stressed the need for Greece to adopt a coherent strategy on inclusion, particularly for students with disabilities, ensuring accessibility, allocating sufficient financial resources, and incorporating inclusive education training into higher education. Given these concerns, it became evident to policymakers at the Special Needs Department of the Greek Ministry of Education that we need to systematize our priorities and actions. Moreover, it became evident that we should investigate possible ways of contributing to the more general dialogue of promoting inclusive education by utilizing our experience in the field of educational exclusion and discrimination. These concerns coincided in 2020 with the formulation of the National Action Plan for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The action plan was devised by a special technical group created in alignment with the UN guidelines and finalized through consultation with the disability movement and civil society. Especially for the field of education, in its 12th strategic target, the national plan specifically addressed a wide array of actions in the field of education for students with disability and special educational needs. Motivated by this target, we decided to further elaborate on its goals in relation to the needs of persons with disabilities and actually formulate the first strategic action plan for equal access to education for persons with disabilities, with the main target to build bridges between special and mainstream education. We followed the following methodology. We collected, recorded, and analyzed extensive evidence on barriers and recommendations regarding the education of students with disability. This evidence was derived from the Directorate's archives, the results of the country's examination by the UN Committee, public consultation on the National Action Plan, and national and international academic literature. We studied good practices in strategic planning from other countries. We utilized all available statistical data and research evidence. We collaborated for the very first time in a systematized way with all relevant ministries, general secretariats, and directorates, including the General Directorate of Primary and Secondary Education, Directorate of Lifelong Learning, Higher Education, and Directorate of Strategic Planning. After many months of consultation, we arrived at our final deliverable, which constitutes a roadmap, providing a clear, coherent, and systematic framework for action on issues related to the protection of the rights of persons with disabilities. More specifically, the Strategic Action Plan includes 14 operational objectives, each analyzed in several actions and projects with a clearly defined implementation deadline in key areas of inclusive policy and practice. As you can see in the table, the 14 operational objectives include reviewing the legal framework, allocating sufficient resources, improving physical and digital accessibility, strengthening early childhood and vocational education, ensuring equal access to lifelong learning and higher education, developing piloting programs for inclusion, and providing services such as refugees with disabilities. The implementation of all the above strategic objectives has started on a pilot basis, and several activities have been or are being implemented. Time does not allow me to present all of them, but indicatively, I can mention that at the moment we have 6 working groups working in parallel. The first one focuses on monitoring the progress of the strategic action plan on a monthly basis. Another one is recording and evaluating the existing legal framework as well as mapping improvements. The possibility of a unified law on education is considered in this respect. The third and fourth one is cross-ministerial and deals specifically with issues of physical and digital accessibility. Actually, the two committees assess the current situation, devise practical guides for physical and digital accessibility for schools, as well as a universal accessibility plan. We have a cross-ministerial committee that devises an action plan for early education intervention in collaboration with all relevant ministries, and finally, a committee for students experiencing multiple discrimination, which deals more specifically with the needs of refugees and Roma students with disabilities. On top of that, and as a result of the strategic planning process, more than 6,000 permanent appointments of special needs teachers have been allocated in the last years. Accessibility material for primary and secondary education, printed and digital, is devised, and teacher training programs in differentiated instruction are provided by the Institute of Educational Policy. And finally, a series of piloting programs with an inclusive focus are currently implemented. I do not wish to tire you with other details. I just want to stress 2 points. First, that the strategic action plan is a result of a collective work and collaboration between different departments, ministries, and agencies. And secondly, that it was drafted with the primary objective of systematically addressing some important challenges in the field. However, it does not represent a comprehensive approach to inclusive education, given that promoting inclusive education requires broader and substantial reforms towards creating a school for all. Rather, it represents an initial effort towards a targeted approach to the key priority areas. In this context, it could probably trigger for central comprehensive planning for the promotion of inclusive education in the form probably of a strategic action plan for the equal access of all students to education. And this is our current progress in our journey towards inclusion, specifically regarding students with disabilities. So far, we have achieved some success in reaching some of our goals. However, it is important to acknowledge that many challenges remain in the ongoing pursuit of creating a school for all children, including the fear of change and the gaps between policy and practice. I would like to conclude by saying that despite these challenges, the personnel in the Directorate of Special Needs Education are fully committed to the inclusive vision, and that we are firmly believing that by daring to tackle what sometimes may appear impossible, we can definitely reach the highest level of what is actually possible. Thank you very much indeed, and I wish you a productive and rewarding conference experience.